The ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle had witnessed centuries of royal secrets, but nothing could have prepared them for what was about to unfold on that cold November morning. Princess Charlotte, the beloved 8-year-old daughter of the Prince and Princess of Wales, vanished from her protected chambers between the hours of 6 and 7 a.m., triggering the most massive security breach in modern British royal history. Within minutes, every exit was sealed, every corridor searched, and every face scrutinized. But it was the security footage that sent shockwaves through the palace, grainy images showing a young man, later identified as Thomas Harrington, the 23-year-old son of Queen Consort Camilla, from a relationship unknown to the public, carrying what appeared to be a small figure wrapped in royal bedding through the servants' passage. The Metropolitan Police, the Royal Protection Command, and MI5 were immediately mobilized. 300 officers flooded the grounds. Helicopters circled overhead. Roadblocks were erected across 3 counties. The Prime Minister was awakened and briefed. Foreign intelligence agencies offered assistance, yet Thomas had seemingly vanished into the British countryside with the young princess, leaving behind only questions, confusion, and a handwritten note that read, "She deserves to know the truth about her family. I'm protecting her from what's coming."
Ow.
With every moment critical and the world watching, the greatest manhunt in British history had begun. The morning started like any other at Windsor Castle. The staff moved quietly through the corridors, preparing breakfast trays and opening curtains to let in the pale winter sunlight. Princess Charlotte had been staying at Windsor, their great-grandmother's former staff, while her parents attended a diplomatic event in Scotland. The security detail assigned to her was among the best in the world, trained to handle any threat imaginable. But no one had imagined a threat could come from within the family itself. Thomas Harrington had been living in the shadows of the royal family for his entire life. Born to Camilla during a brief relationship in her youth, he had been raised by his father in the countryside. Far from the spotlight and scrutiny that followed his mother's every move, his existence had been one of the most closely guarded secrets in the monarchy, known only to a handful of senior officials and protected by legal agreements that ensured his anonymity. He had grown up watching his mother on television, attending state functions, and eventually becoming queen consort, while he remained invisible, a footnote that could never be written. The resentment had built slowly over the years. Thomas wasn't angry about the money or the titles. He had been provided for financially, educated at good schools under an assumed name, and given opportunities that most people could only dream of. What ate at him was the denial of his very existence. The way his mother's life had been rewritten as though he had never been born. He had half-siblings who would never know him, a family tree that had been pruned to remove his branch entirely. Everything changed 6 months earlier when Thomas discovered documents in his late father's belongings. Letters, photographs, and legal papers that revealed not just his own hidden heritage, but something far more disturbing. There were references to agreements made decades ago, promises broken, and suggestions of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the royal household. The documents hinted at decisions made about bloodlines, legitimacy, and the carefully constructed public narrative of the royal family. Among these papers was information about Princess Charlotte that Thomas believed the public hand. Charlotte herself deserved to know. Thomas had tried the proper channels first. He had written letters to his mother, requesting a private meeting. They went unanswered. He had contacted the private secretary's office, hoping to arrange a discreet conversation. His calls were never returned. He had even reached out to certain members of Parliament who had expressed reform-minded views about the monarchy. They had been polite, but ultimately unwilling to involve themselves in such a sensitive family matter. Each rejection pushed him further toward a decision he knew would change everything. The plan had taken months to develop. Thomas had used his father's old connections, people who had worked at the palace, suppliers who made deliveries, maintenance workers who knew the building's layout to piece together the security protocols and daily routines. He had obtained staff credentials through a contact who owed his father a favor. He had studied the guard rotations, the camera blind spots, and the rarely used passages that connected different parts of the ancient castle. He had learned that Princess Charlotte would be staying at Windsor during her parents' absence, and that the security, while thorough, followed predictable patterns. The night before, Thomas had entered the castle grounds as part of a catering crew delivering supplies for a small reception. He had hidden in a storage room near the servants' quarters, waiting through the long hours until dawn when the shift change would create his window of opportunity. His heart had pounded so hard he thought it might give him away. But he remained still, breathing slowly, preparing himself for what he was about to do. At 6:15 in the morning, Thomas emerged from his hiding place. He wore the uniform of a palace steward, complete with the proper identification badge he had carefully forged. He moved through the corridors with purpose. Nodding to the few staff members he encountered, his face calm despite the terror racing through his veins. He knew exactly where Princess Charlotte's room was located, and which route would take him there with the fewest cameras. The princess's personal protection officer was stationed outside her door. But at this early hour, he was at the end of a long night shift, tired and expecting nothing more eventful than the arrival of the breakfast tray. Thomas approached with a clipboard and a story about a scheduling change that required the officer's immediate attention at the security desk. The guard was suspicious at first, but Thomas's credentials appeared legitimate, and the request seemed routine enough. After a moment's hesitation, the officer spoke into his radio, received confirmation that there was indeed an administrative matter requiring his attention, and stepped away, leaving Thomas with a clear path to the door. Thomas's hand shook as he turned the handle. The room was dark, except for a small nightlight, casting a soft glow near the bed. Princess Charlotte was sleeping peacefully, her dark hair spread across the pillow, a stuffed animal tucked under one arm. For a moment, Thomas almost turned back. She looked so small, so innocent, so completely unaware of the storm that surrounded her existence. But he thought of the documents, the lies, the truth that was being kept from everyone, and he moved forward. He had prepared a cloth with a mild sedative, something that would keep her drowsy and compliant but cause no harm. He gently pressed it over her mouth and nose, whispering reassurances as she stirred, and her eyes fluttered open in confusion. Within seconds, she was unconscious again. Thomas wrapped her in the bedding, lifting her carefully into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. He placed the note he had written on the pillow and turned toward the door. The walk back through the corridors felt like it lasted hours, though it was only minutes. Thomas kept expecting someone to shout, to raise the alarm, to tackle him to the ground. But the castle was still quiet in these early morning hours, and most of the staff assumed he was simply one of them, going about his duties. He took the servants' passage that led to the ground floor, avoiding the main staircases and the areas with the heaviest security presence. His van was parked in the service area where deliveries were made. Thomas had arrived with the catering crew the night before, and no one had questioned why his vehicle remained overnight. He placed Charlotte carefully in the back, covering her with blankets, to keep her warm and hidden from view. His hands were trembling so badly now that he could barely fit the key into the ignition. As he drove toward the exit gate, a security officer waved him through with barely a glance. It was a routine departure, a catering van leaving after completing its job. Thomas forced himself to drive at a normal speed to appear calm and unhurried, even though every instinct screamed at him to press the accelerator to the floor and flee as fast as possible. He exited the castle grounds and merged onto the main road, heading north toward a destination he had prepared weeks ago. Behind him, the sun was rising over Windsor Castle, and in approximately 12 minutes, a maid would enter Princess Charlotte's room with a breakfast tray, discover the empty bed and the note, and trigger the alarm that would mobilize the largest security response in modern British history. But for now, in these final moments of calm before the storm, Thomas drove through the quiet countryside, Princess Charlotte sleeping in the back of his van, and convinced himself that what he was doing was necessary, that history would eventually understand that the truth was worth any price. The alarm system at Windsor Castle erupted at exactly 6:47 a.m. The maid who discovered the empty bed dropped the breakfast tray, the crash of breaking china echoing through the hallway as she screamed for help. Within seconds, the personal protection officer who had been called away rushed back into the room, his face draining of color as he saw the unmade bed, the note on the pillow, and no sign of the princess. He grabbed his radio and transmitted the code that every Royal Protection officer dreads. Monarch down. I repeat, Monarch down. Princess Charlotte is missing. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every exit from the castle was sealed within 90 seconds. Armed officers appeared from seemingly nowhere, taking positions at every door, gate, and potential escape route. The head of Royal Protection Command, Commander James Whitmore, arrived at the scene within 4 minutes, his breakfast abandoned and his shirt still unbuttoned under his jacket. He read the note once, then again, his expression hardening with each word. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner was notified immediately. She activated the largest emergency response protocol available. 300 officers were mobilized from stations across London and the surrounding counties. Helicopter units were scrambled from 3 different locations. The motorway patrol was alerted to stop and search vehicles matching the description of anything suspicious. Roadblocks were established on every major route leading away from Windsor. The British Transport Police locked down train stations. Airport security was elevated to maximum alert. By 7:15, the Prime Minister had been awakened and briefed on the situation. She sat in her residence, still in her nightgown, listening to the details with growing horror. A member of the royal family, taken from inside Windsor Castle itself. It was unprecedented. It was catastrophic. It would dominate every headline in the world within hours. She authorized the involvement of MI5 and gave permission for any resources necessary to bring. Commander Whitmore stood in the security control room watching the footage from the previous night play on multiple screens. The technical team had worked backwards from the discovery time, tracking every person who had moved through the corridors near Charlotte's room. It didn't take long to identify the anomaly: a man in staff uniform who appeared at 6:14 a.m., spoke briefly with the protection officer, and entered Charlotte's room alone. The same man emerged 3 minutes later, carrying what appeared to be bundled bedding, and walked calmly toward the service passages. The team followed his route through camera after camera, watching him place his bundle in a van and drive away. They captured the license plate clearly, ran it through the database, and discovered it was registered to a catering company that had indeed provided services at the castle the previous evening. A call to the company's owner revealed that the van in question had been reported stolen 2 days earlier. Dead end. But facial recognition software was already working on the man's identity. The computer scanned through millions of images, comparing the angles and features captured by the castle's cameras. The initial results came back inconclusive. The man wasn't in any criminal database, wasn't on any watch list, and didn't match any known security threats. Then a junior analyst suggested broadening the search parameters to include archived society photographs and historical records. That's when the match appeared. The man's name was Thomas Harrington. The records were sealed and encrypted, but with authorization from the very top levels of government, they were opened. Commander Whitmore read through the documents with increasing disbelief. Thomas was Camilla's son from before her first marriage, a secret that had been buried for decades. He had been living under an assumed name, provided for, but never acknowledged. The documents included psychological evaluations from years ago that described him as intelligent but resentful, someone who felt betrayed by the circumstances of his birth. The revelation sent shockwaves through the emergency response team. This wasn't a random kidnapping or a terrorist act. This was family. This was personal. And that made it infinitely more complicated. Commander Whitmore immediately contacted the Queen Consort's private office, requesting an urgent meeting. Camilla was at Clarence's house, having just been informed of Charlotte's disappearance. When Whitmore arrived and revealed the identity of the suspected abductor, she went completely silent, her face turning ashen. Meanwhile, Thomas was driving through the countryside, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. Princess Charlotte had woken up once, confused and frightened, asking where she was and why she couldn't move properly. The sedative was still affecting her coordination. Thomas had pulled over, spoken to her gently, explaining that he was taking her somewhere safe, that he wasn't going to hurt her, that he just needed her to trust him for a little while. She had started to cry, calling for her mother, and Thomas had felt something crack inside his chest. He gave her water and a biscuit, tried to comfort her, but her tears didn't stop. He had reached his destination by 8:30, a small cottage in the Lake District that he had rented under a false name 3 weeks earlier. It was isolated, surrounded by hills and forests, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through farmland. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away. Thomas had stocked the cottage with food, supplies, and everything he thought they might need for several days. He had also installed additional locks on the doors and covered the windows with heavy curtains. Inside the cottage, Thomas tried to make Charlotte comfortable. He showed her the bedroom he had prepared, filled with toys and books he had bought specifically for her. He explained that she could have anything she wanted to eat, that she could watch television if she liked, that he just needed her to stay here for a few days, while some important things were sorted out. Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed, hugging her knees to her chest, still crying softly. She asked when she could go home. Thomas didn't have an answer. Back at Windsor Castle, the investigation was expanding rapidly. Digital forensics teams were analyzing Thomas's phone records, bank transactions, and online activity from the past 6 months. They discovered he had been researching the royal family extensively, downloading documents and visiting websites about historical scandals and cover-ups. He had purchased camping equipment, non-perishable food, and a burner phone. He had withdrawn large amounts of cash from ATMs across London. Everything pointed to careful planning. The police traced his rental history and found he had been viewing properties in remote areas of Scotland, Wales, and northern England. There were dozens of possibilities, and search teams couldn't cover them all simultaneously. Commander Whitmore made the difficult decision to focus resources on the most likely locations based on Thomas's patterns and the timeline of his movements. Specialized search and rescue units were deployed to the Lake District, Snowdonia, and the Highlands, equipped with thermal imaging drones and tracking dogs. By midday, the news had broken publicly. The palace had tried to keep it quiet, but with 300 officers involved and helicopters crisscrossing the sky, secrecy was impossible. The first reports appeared on social media, then traditional news outlets picked up the story. Within an hour, it was the top headline on every news channel in the world. Camera crews gathered outside Windsor Castle, outside Clarence House, outside Kensington Palace, where William and Catherine were racing back from Scotland. Reporters speculated wildly about terrorists, foreign agents, and inside jobs. No one yet knew the truth about Thomas's identity. William and Catherine arrived at Windsor by early afternoon, their faces tight with barely controlled panic. They were briefed in a secure room, listening as Commander Whitmore explained who had taken their daughter and what they knew about his motivations. Catherine broke down, her hands shaking as she tried to process the information. William's expression was stone, but his eyes burned with fury. He demanded to know how this had been possible, how someone connected to the family had managed to infiltrate the castle and take his daughter from her bed. There were no good answers. The decision was made to reveal Thomas's identity to the public. The palace communications team crafted a carefully worded statement explaining that the suspect was related to the family, that efforts were underway to establish contact, and that they believed Charlotte was not in immediate physical danger. The statement asked Thomas to make contact, to consider the well-being of the child, to end this peacefully. It was released at 3 p.m., causing another explosion of media coverage and public shock. In the cottage, Thomas watched the news coverage on a small television. He saw his own photograph displayed across the screen, saw the reporters discussing his life, saw the crowds gathering outside the palace, demanding Charlotte's safe return. He saw his mother's face in a photograph looking strained and elderly. He felt a stab of something he couldn't quite identify. Guilt, anger, vindication, all mixed together. He turned off the television. Charlotte had stopped crying but remained withdrawn, sitting silently in the bedroom, refusing to eat properly. Thomas tried to engage her in conversation to explain why he had done this, but she just stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. She was 8 years old. She didn't understand conspiracies or family secrets or the grievances of grown men. She just wanted her parents. Thomas realized with growing horror that he might have made a terrible mistake. By evening, the police had narrowed their search area significantly. Analysis of cellular tower data showed that Thomas's burner phone had pinged towers in Cumbria during the morning hours. The rental property databases revealed that a man matching his description had rented a cottage near Grasmere, using cash and a fake ID 3 weeks earlier. Armed response units were mobilized and began moving toward the location, maintaining radio silence to avoid tipping off their target. Commander Whitmore assembled a specialist negotiation team, including psychologists who had reviewed Thomas's background and could provide insights into his mental state. The priority was Charlotte's safety, but they also needed to understand what Thomas wanted, what he hoped to achieve, and whether he could be reasoned with. Whitmore had seen situations like this go very wrong, and he was determined to bring the princess home alive. As darkness fell over the Lake District, Thomas stood at the cottage window, looking out at the hills silhouetted against the twilight sky. He could hear Charlotte crying softly in the bedroom again. He had meant to be her protector, to reveal truths that would set them all free from the lies and manipulation of the royal system. Instead, he had become her captor, the cause of her tears, a figure of terror in her life. He picked up the burner phone he had bought for this purpose and stared at it for a long moment. Then he turned it on for the first time, allowing it to connect to the network. Knowing that doing so would reveal his location to anyone looking, he was ready to talk, ready to explain, ready to make them understand. He just hoped they would listen before they came through the door with guns drawn. The signal from Thomas's burner phone lit up the tracking screens at the command center like a beacon. Within seconds, the technical team had triangulated his position to within 100 meters. The cottage near Grasmere. Commander Whitmore felt a surge of grim satisfaction they had been right about the location. He immediately contacted the armed response units that were already in the area, giving them the exact coordinates and ordering them to establish a perimeter, but not to approach until the negotiation team was in position. The drive to the Lake District took 3 hours through the darkness, with police vehicles racing along motorways with lights flashing and sirens clearing the path. Commander Whitmore traveled with the negotiation team, going over strategy during the journey. The lead negotiator was a woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychologist who had successfully talked down dozens of hostage situations over her 20-year career. She had studied Thomas's profile during the day, read the documents about his childhood, and understood the complex web of resentment and abandonment that had driven him to this point. By 10 p.m., perimeter was secure. Armed officers had taken positions around the cottage, their night vision equipment showing them every approach, route, and exit. Snipers were stationed on elevated positions with clear lines of sight to the windows. The cottage itself was dark, except for a single light in what appeared to be the main room. Thermal imaging showed 2 heat signatures inside, one adult-sized and one much smaller. Both were alive and moving. That was the most important information of all. Dr. Mitchell set up her command post in a mobile unit parked half a mile down the road, out of sight and sound of the cottage. She had communication equipment that would allow her to call the burner phone Thomas had activated. The protocol was clear: establish contact, build rapport, avoid making demands initially. Listen more than talk. Look for any indication of Thomas's mental state and intentions. The goal was to end this without violence, to bring Charlotte home unharmed, and if possible, to bring Thomas in alive as well. Inside the cottage, Thomas paced back and forth across the small living room. The burner phone sat on the table, its screen glowing in the dim light. He had turned it on knowing they would find him, but now he was questioning that decision. Part of him wanted this confrontation, wanted the chance to explain everything and force people to listen. Another part was terrified of what would happen when they arrived. Would they storm in with guns? Would they give him a chance to speak? Would anyone care about the documents and the truth he had discovered? Charlotte had finally fallen asleep in the bedroom, exhausted from crying and fear. Thomas had checked on her several times, making sure she was warm enough, adjusting the blankets, feeling wretched every time he looked at her small form. She had eaten a little bit of soup earlier, though she had refused to speak to him. He couldn't blame her. In her world, he was the monster who had stolen her from her bed, separated her from her parents, and brought her to this strange place. The fact that he believed he had good reasons meant nothing to an 8-year-old child. The burner phone rang at 10:23 p.m. The sound was startling in the quiet cottage, making Thomas jump. He stared at it for 3 rings before picking it up. He didn't say hello, just held it to his ear and waited. Dr. Mitchell's voice was calm and professional, but with an undertone of warmth. She introduced herself by first name only, explained that she wanted to talk with him about the situation, and asked if he was willing to have a conversation. Thomas said yes, his voice rough from stress and lack of sleep. The negotiation had begun. For the first 30 minutes, Dr. Mitchell simply listened. She asked open-ended questions about how Thomas was feeling, what had led him to this point, what he hoped would happen. Thomas talked, the words pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. He spoke about growing up knowing who his mother was but being told he could never acknowledge it. He talked about watching his half-siblings grow up in the spotlight while he remained invisible. He described the documents he had found, the secrets they revealed, the conspiracy he believed existed at the highest levels of the royal family. Dr. Mitchell didn't argue with him or challenge his beliefs. She acknowledged his feelings, validated his sense of hurt and betrayal, and gently asked questions that helped her understand his worldview. She asked about Charlotte specifically. How was the princess doing? Was she frightened? Had she eaten? Did she need anything? Thomas admitted that Charlotte was scared and had been crying. He said he had never wanted to frighten her, that this wasn't about hurting anyone. It was about forcing people to pay attention to the truth. Meanwhile, Commander Whitmore was coordinating with William and Catherine, who were waiting at a secure location 20 miles away. They desperately wanted to be closer, to see their daughter. But Whitmore had firmly explained that their presence would complicate the situation. Catherine was barely holding herself together, demanding updates every few minutes. William was more controlled, but clearly struggling with the powerlessness of the situation. Both parents wanted to speak directly to Thomas, to plead with him, but Dr. Mitchell advised against it. She needed to maintain control of the negotiation, and emotional appeals from the parents could either help or completely backfire depending on Thomas's state of mind. The conversation continued through the night. Dr. Mitchell learned that Thomas had copies of the documents he considered evidence of wrongdoing. He wanted them released to the press, wanted an independent investigation into the royal family's handling of certain historical matters, wanted his existence acknowledged publicly by his mother. These were his demands, the things he believed would make this worthwhile. Dr. Mitchell wrote everything down, knowing that negotiators from the palace and government would need to assess what concessions, if any, could be offered. Around 2 a.m., Charlotte woke up screaming from a nightmare. Thomas heard her crying and told Dr. Mitchell he needed to check on the child. Dr. Mitchell agreed, but asked him to leave the phone line open. Thomas set the phone down and went to the bedroom. Charlotte was sitting up in bed, sobbing for her mother. Thomas tried to comfort her, but she recoiled from him, pressing herself against the headboard. The fear in her eyes cut through him like a knife. He grabbed a glass of water and left it on the bedside table, then returned to the phone, his voice shaken. Dr. Mitchell seized on this moment. She spoke quietly about how traumatic this experience was for Charlotte, how the child was suffering regardless of Thomas's intentions, how every hour that passed was another hour of terror for an innocent little girl who had done nothing wrong. She wasn't accusing or judgmental, just stating facts that Thomas couldn't deny. She asked him to think about what kind of person he wanted to be, what kind of legacy he wanted to have. Did he want to be remembered as the man who traumatized a child, or did he want to find another way to pursue his goals? Thomas was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said he didn't know what to do anymore. He had thought he was doing the right thing, but Charlotte's fear had shown him that whatever justifications he had constructed were meaningless compared to the harm he was causing. Dr. Mitchell sensed an opening and gently suggested that perhaps it was time to think about how this could end, how Charlotte could be returned to her family, how Thomas could tell his story without anyone else getting hurt. The discussion shifted to practical matters. Thomas wanted guarantees that he would have a chance to speak publicly about the documents, that he wouldn't be killed by armed police when he surrendered, that his concerns would be taken seriously rather than dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed individual. Dr. Mitchell couldn't make all those promises herself, but she could facilitate conversations with people who had the authority to negotiate terms. She asked Thomas if he would be willing to let Charlotte go first, as a sign of good faith, while they continued to work out the details of his surrender. Thomas hesitated. Charlotte was his leverage, the only reason anyone was listening to him at all. If he let her go, would they still honor any agreements they made? Or would they simply storm the cottage and arrest him without caring about what he had to say? Dr. Mitchell seemed to read his thoughts. She explained that releasing Charlotte would actually strengthen his position, would show that he was rational and capable of making good decisions, would make authorities more likely to treat him fairly rather than as a dangerous criminal. As dawn approached, Thomas made his decision. He would release Charlotte first. Dr. Mitchell worked out the logistics with Commander Whitmore. Thomas would bring Charlotte out of the cottage at exactly 6 a.m. He would walk her to the end of the dirt road, approximately 200 meters from the cottage, where officers would be waiting to receive her. Thomas would then return to the cottage alone, and negotiations about his surrender would continue. Armed officers would hold their positions and not approach unless Thomas posed an immediate threat. Charlotte was awake when Thomas entered the bedroom at 5:45 a.m. He told her she was going home, that she would see her parents very soon. The relief on her face was mixed with suspicion. She didn't trust him, didn't believe anything he said. He helped her put on her shoes and a warm coat, explaining that they would take a short walk and then people would be there to bring her to her mom and dad. Charlotte didn't say anything, just watched him warily as though expecting a trick. They left the cottage at exactly 6 a.m., as agreed. The morning was cold and misty, the sun just beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Thomas held Charlotte's hand gently, aware of how small it felt in his grip. They walked down the dirt road in silence, their footsteps crunching on gravel. In the trees and behind cover, dozens of armed officers tracked their movement, fingers near triggers, ready to respond to any sudden action. When they reached the designated spot, 2 unarmed officers stood waiting, both women, both trained in child crisis response. Thomas knelt down to Charlotte's level and tried to say something, to explain or apologize or say goodbye, but the words wouldn't come. Charlotte pulled her hand away and ran to the officers without looking back. One officer scooped her up, while the other immediately began walking back down the road to Ward, where an ambulance was waiting. Charlotte buried her face in the officer's shoulder and began to cry again. But these were different tears. Release. The beginning of processing trauma. Thomas stood there for a moment watching them go, feeling the weight of everything he had done settling onto his shoulders. Then he turned and walked back toward the cottage alone. Dr. Mitchell's voice was in his ear. Through a small radio they had provided, she was praising him for doing the right thing, assuring him that they would continue working toward a peaceful resolution, asking him to stay calm. Thomas entered the cottage, sat down at the table, and waited for whatever came next. Within minutes, Charlotte was in the ambulance being checked over by paramedics. She was physically unharmed. No injuries, no signs of assault, just exhaustion and emotional trauma. William and Catherine arrived moments later, having been held at a checkpoint nearby. When Charlotte saw her mother, she lunged from the paramedic's arms and wrapped herself around Catherine's neck, sobbing. William stood with his arms around both of them, his eyes closed, whispering thank you over and over to no one and everyone at once. Back at the cottage, the negotiation entered its final phase. Thomas had released Charlotte, fulfilled his promise, and shown good faith. Now it was time to discuss his surrender. The terms were these. He would be arrested and charged with kidnapping. But the documents he claimed to have would be examined by an independent party. He would have the opportunity to present his case in court. He would be evaluated by mental health professionals. He would not be shot as long as he complied with instructions. These weren't the guarantees he had initially wanted, but they were the best available compromise between justice and his desire to be heard. At 8:47 a.m., Thomas Harrington walked out of the cottage with his hands raised above his head. Armed officers surrounded him within seconds, forced him to the ground, and secured him in handcuffs. He didn't resist. He didn't fight. He simply lay there in the cold morning grass, knowing that his brief moment of being seen, of being heard, of mattering to the world had come to an end. The aftermath of Princess Charlotte's abduction sent shockwaves through every level of British society and far beyond. Within hours of Thomas's arrest, the story had become the dominant global news event. Analyzed and debated in every major publication and television network worldwide, the revelation that a member of the extended royal family had been responsible added layers of scandal and intrigue that the media consumed voraciously. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a theory. The monarchy itself seemed to be on trial in the court of public opinion. Thomas was taken to a high-security facility in London and placed under observation in a special unit designed for prisoners who might be targets of violence or who posed unusual security concerns. The interrogation began immediately, detectives and intelligence officials spending hours questioning him about his planning, his motivations, and most importantly, the documents he claimed proved conspiracy and wrongdoing within the royal family. Thomas cooperated fully, providing detailed answers and handing over copies of everything he had discovered in his father's belongings. The documents were indeed extraordinary. They included letters from palace officials discussing how to manage the situation of Camilla's first son, financial agreements showing payments made in exchange for his silence and distance from the family, and most controversially, references to decisions made about bloodlines and succession that raised questions about how much manipulation had occurred behind the scenes of the carefully curated royal narrative. There were also personal letters from Camilla to Thomas's father, written decades ago, expressing regret about the circumstances, but ultimately prioritizing her royal position over acknowledging her son. A team of forensic document analysts and historians was assembled to verify the authenticity of these materials. The process took weeks, but the conclusion was clear: the documents were genuine. They represented a historical record that had been deliberately hidden from public view, and even from most palace officials. The question now was what to do with this information. The government, the palace, and various legal advisors engaged in intense, closed-door discussions about how to proceed. Princess Charlotte was under the care of the finest child psychologists and trauma specialists in the country. The physical examination at the hospital had confirmed she was unharmed, but the emotional and psychological impact was significant. She had nightmares regularly, developed anxiety about being alone, and became clingy in a way that was understandable but heartbreaking for her parents. William and Catherine took extended leave from their public duties to focus entirely on their daughter's recovery, bringing in specialists to provide therapy and creating a protective environment where Charlotte could begin to feel safe again. The public reaction was complex and divided. Many people expressed outrage at Thomas's actions, viewing him as a dangerous criminal who had traumatized an innocent child, regardless of his grievances. Protests were held outside the jail where he was being held, with people demanding the maximum possible sentence. However, there was also a significant portion of the population who viewed Thomas more sympathetically, seeing him as a victim of the royal family's callousness who had been driven to desperate measures by a lifetime of rejection and deception. These supporters argued that the monarchy's treatment of him was the real scandal, and that Charlotte's kidnapping, while wrong, was a predictable outcome of systemic injustice. The media coverage became increasingly focused on Camilla herself. Reporters dug into her past, interviewed people who had known her decades earlier, constructed timelines that painted a complicated picture. She had been young when Thomas was born, unmarried, and under tremendous pressure from family and society. The decision to distance herself from the child had likely not been made lightly, but it had been made nonetheless, and maintained consistently for more than 2 decades. The question everyone was asking was whether she would finally acknowledge her son publicly. The palace's initial strategy was silence. Officials refused to comment beyond brief statements about being grateful for Charlotte's safe return and allowing the legal process to proceed regarding Thomas. But the pressure mounted daily. Members of Parliament called for transparency. Editorial boards demanded accountability. Even some constitutional experts began suggesting that this scandal revealed fundamental problems with how the monarchy operated in modern society. Something had to give. 6 weeks after Charlotte's abduction, Camilla broke her silence. In a carefully orchestrated interview with a trusted journalist, She acknowledged that Thomas was indeed her son, born before her first marriage, and that she had not been involved in his life due to circumstances she now deeply regretted. She appeared genuinely emotional during the interview, her voice breaking several times as she spoke about the impossible choices she had faced as a young woman and the pain of living with those decisions. She said she understood Thomas's anger and wished things had been different, though she was careful not to excuse his actions or minimize the trauma he had caused Charlotte. The interview was watched by millions and generated mixed reactions. Some viewers felt genuine sympathy for Camilla, seeing her as trapped by the rigid expectations of royal life. Others viewed it as too little, too late. A public relations exercise designed to rehabilitate her image rather than a sincere reckoning with her choices. The debate raged on television panels, in newspaper columns, and across social media platforms. The monarchy itself seemed to be at a crossroads, with questions about its relevance and its treatment of individuals caught in its machinery becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Thomas's trial began 8 months after the abduction. The charges were serious kidnapping, child endangerment, and several security-related offenses. The prosecution presented a straightforward case. Thomas had carefully planned and executed the abduction of a child, causing psychological trauma and triggering a massive security crisis. His motivations, whatever they were, did not justify his actions. Children cannot be used as pawns in adult disputes, regardless of how legitimate those disputes might be. The defense strategy was more nuanced. Thomas's lawyers didn't deny what he had done, but they provided extensive context about his life, the rejection he had experienced, and the mental health issues that had developed as a result of living in the shadows of the royal family. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological impact of parental abandonment and identity suppression. The documents Thomas had discovered were entered into evidence, forcing the court to grapple with uncomfortable historical truths about the monarchy's behavior. The defense argued for leniency, suggesting that Thomas was himself a victim who had acted out of desperation rather than malice. The trial lasted 3 weeks and captivated the nation. Charlotte did not testify, her parents having fought successfully to keep her out of the courtroom. But a video recording of a gentle interview with a child psychologist was presented to the jury. In it, Charlotte described waking up confused, being carried away from her home, and feeling scared in this strange cottage. She said the man had not hurt her physically, but that she had been terrified she would never see her family again. The jury watched in silence, several members visibly moved. Thomas took the stand in his own defense, a risky move that his lawyers had debated intensely. He spoke for 2 hours, describing his childhood, his discovery of his identity, his attempts to be acknowledged by his family, and the desperation that had driven him to such extreme action. He apologized directly to Charlotte, his voice cracking as he said he would regret frightening her for the rest of his life. He apologized to William and Catherine for the pain he had caused them. But he also spoke defiantly about the royal family's treatment of him, about the injustice of being erased from existence, about the lies that had been maintained for decades. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. They forced Thomas to acknowledge that he had other options besides kidnapping, that he could have gone to the press, written a book, or pursued legal action. They made him admit that he had terrified a child who had done nothing to him, that his actions were selfish and dangerous regardless of his grievances. By the end, Thomas looked exhausted and defeated. The brief moment of defiance drained away. The jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching a verdict. They found Thomas guilty on all charges. The judge, in delivering the sentence, acknowledged the complexity of the case, but emphasized that society cannot tolerate the abduction of children under any circumstances. Thomas was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 years if he demonstrated rehabilitation and genuine remorse. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions, some people cheering, others shouting in protest, guards moving quickly to maintain order. In the months that followed, life slowly returned to a version of normal for the key figures involved. Princess Charlotte continued her therapy and gradually improved, though her parents knew the experience had changed her in ways that would take years to fully understand. William and Catherine threw themselves into charitable work related to child safety and trauma recovery, turning their personal nightmare into advocacy for other families. Camilla retreated somewhat from public life, her relationship with the British public permanently altered by the revelations. She made several quiet attempts to establish some form of contact with Thomas through intermediaries. But he refused all communication, at least initially. Some members of the royal family privately expressed sympathy for Leah Thomas's situation while publicly maintaining support for his prosecution. The documents he had revealed sparked a limited internal review of historical practices. Though much of this occurred behind closed doors, away from media scrutiny, Thomas adjusted to prison life with difficulty. He was housed separately from the general population due to the high-profile nature of his case and concerns about his safety. He participated in mental health programs and eventually began working in the prison library. Finding some measure of peace in books and quiet reflection, letters arrived regularly from people who viewed him as a sympathetic figure, though he rarely responded. He spent long hours thinking about Charlotte, imagining the life she would lead, hoping that someday she might understand he had never meant to harm her. Even though he knew she had every right to hate him forever, the broader impact on the monarchy was harder to measure, but undeniably significant. Public opinion polls showed declining support for the royal family, particularly among younger generations who viewed the treatment of Thomas as emblematic of an outdated and unjust system. Calls for reform grew louder, with some activists demanding greater transparency and accountability, while others pushed for complete abolition of the monarchy itself. The royal family responded by modernizing certain practices and being more open about their operations. Though critics argued these changes were superficial, 3 years after the abduction, on Charlotte's 11th birthday, she asked her parents about what had happened to her when she was 8. She remembered parts of it, but had been shielded from many details. William and Catherine sat with her in the garden at Kensington Palace and told her the full story: who Thomas was, why he had taken her, what had happened to him afterward. Charlotte listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions. When they finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that surprised them both. She wanted to write Thomas a letter. William and Catherine were initially resistant, wanting to protect their daughter from any further connection to her trauma. But Charlotte's therapist suggested it might actually be part of her healing process, a way to reclaim agency and move forward on her own terms. After much discussion, they agreed to let her write whatever she wanted. With the understanding that she was under no obligation to send it, Charlotte spent weeks working on the letter, writing draft after draft. The final version was simple and direct. She told Thomas that what he did was wrong and had hurt her badly. She said she had been afraid for a long time afterward and still sometimes had bad dreams. But she also said she had learned about his life, about how he had been treated, and that she was sorry he had felt so alone. She didn't forgive him exactly, but she acknowledged his pain and said she hoped he could find peace. She ended by saying that she was going to be okay, that she was surrounded by people who loved her, and that she wanted him to know she didn't hate him even though she probably should. The letter was delivered to Thomas through official channels. When he read it, he sat on his prison bed and cried for the first time since his arrest. The grace and maturity in Charlotte's words, her ability to see him as a person, despite what he had done to her, broke something loose inside him. He wrote back a long letter explaining everything he felt: his sorrow, his shame, his regret, his hope that she would have a wonderful life. He told her she was a remarkable person, and that if the royal family had any sense, they would let her help guide it toward becoming something better than it had been. The letters were never made public, remaining private between two people who had been thrust into extraordinary circumstances neither had chosen. Whether they ever corresponded again, whether Charlotte eventually found a way to truly forgive him, whether Thomas ultimately found redemption, these questions remained unanswered as time moved forward. What was clear was that the events of that November morning had changed everyone involved in profound and permanent ways. The scandal gradually faded from the front pages as news stories captured public attention, yet it left an indelible mark on British history. Scholars and historians would debate its meaning for decades to come. Was it a tragedy born of royal cruelty and institutional callousness? Was it the criminal act of a disturbed individual who refused to take responsibility for his choices? Was it perhaps both things simultaneously, a complicated truth that resisted simple interpretation? The answers depended on who was asking and what they believed about family, duty, truth, and justice. Years later, long after Thomas had served his sentence and been released into quiet anonymity, long after Charlotte had grown into a thoughtful young woman who worked with organizations supporting children affected by trauma, people still discussed what had happened. The cottage in the Lake District became something of an unofficial memorial site, visitors occasionally leaving flowers or notes reflecting on the complicated human story that had unfolded there. The documents Thomas had revealed were eventually published in their entirety by a historian, writing a comprehensive book about the modern monarchy. Ensuring that the truths he had desperately wanted exposed became part of the permanent record. In the end, there were no perfect villains or heroes in this story. It's just imperfect people making choices in impossible circumstances and living with the consequences of those choices. The pursuit of truth had collided with the protection of innocence. The desire for acknowledgement had led to unconscionable action. The weight of history and institution had crushed individuals beneath it. And through it all, a small girl had been frightened. A young man had destroyed his own life, and a family had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. These facts remained stark and unchangeable, a reminder that even in the modern world, the old conflicts between personal desire and duty, between justice and mercy, between the individual and the institution remained as relevant and unresolved as ever.